All right. So this morning, I have a topic, and I wasn't sure what to call it because I wasn't really sure how this message was going to go. I had a couple different things I was working on, and sometimes you don't know what to talk about, right? You struggle a little bit. But I love to read. And if I could read without falling asleep, I would read 12 hours a day. Someday when I retire, I'm going to try to read. I'll probably end up spending most of my life sleeping. But for the time I can stay awake, I read a lot of stuff, and it's a lot of fun, and I learn about a lot of things. Mostly the books I read are about the Bible. They're about God or about Jesus, Paul, things like that. And you know, you get a lot of different thoughts go in your mind when you're reading things by other people. And you start to try to make connections between the different people you're reading, or the things you believed, the things you learn in church, all things that are going on in the world and stuff that you've experienced in life, and you try to put things together. So I'm reading this book, and I'm not even halfway through it yet, but I stopped because already this person has said things that made all kinds of connections for me based on other people I've read, and other things. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But all the connections that I make are they're in my own mind, right? Some of them might be true, some of them might not be true. But, you know, when you come up with some that are really neat, for me, I want to share it. And where a better place to share it than right here, right? That's what we're going to do today. Last week, I spoke on the resurrection, an incredible and miraculous, momentous occasion that happened for humanity, right? And it allowed, or it made a way for God to be able to come and dwell right with us in every person. So it's present. It's about his presence, and it relates to the present moment. So it doesn't relate to anything that happened in the past other than the resurrection. And it doesn't relate to, honestly, anything that's going to happen to the future. It's right now, every moment with God that matters. Most believers think that it's about the future, right? It's about I'm going to heaven or I'm going to hell. And that's what I have to be saved from. They believe in things like, you know, the tribulation is coming, the millennium is coming, or some believe there is no millennium, or the millennium's here, or the millennium's there. All kinds of different things about the future, and we call that eschatological beliefs about the future regarding God. They are looking for the kingdom to come straight to earth, so that the earth initially is going to be chaotic and full of war and bloodshed, but eventually it's going to be like utopia, right? And that's what they're desiring. That's what they're thinking about when they think about things like the resurrection. And they're stuck in the future, not in the present. But one thing everybody is right about is that it is about God's reign and God's kingdom. It just depends on where you put that in your life or in the timeline as you see things. All right? Kingdoms are part of the earth. We call them nations, kingdoms, whatever you want to call it. They're very important. You know, they help define people as they live on earth, as they walk and breathe. They give us a place to live. They give us some security. But the kingdom of God is the kingdom. And God as king is the king and is very important. So what we're going to get into a little bit today is history. And a lot of times when we think of kingdoms, we think of history, right? What is the history of your country? What is the history of a kingdom? So in the Bible, we can read things about God's kingdom being everlasting. It's always been. So does God's kingdom have a history? Yeah, right? Because God's kingdom involves people. So there's a history. But history isn't everything, because when we think of history, what is history? It's the past, right? History's the past. The present in God's kingdom for us is everything, what we are every moment. So we're going to have a word of prayer, and then we'll get into this, and hopefully it will be a lot of fun. Lord, we're thankful that we're here together, gathered to learn things about you and the Bible and the scriptures, how ancient people might have viewed things, and how the way they viewed things, as I'm learning, really aren't so different than how we view things today in our own world, our own cultures, our own nations. And as we all see things differently, and there are divisions and issues over those things, sometimes I wish, Lord, that we would set some things aside and focus on you and what is the most important. And I think as we look at this today and some things from the Old Testament, that is exactly what at least one person desired. Even though they didn't have the full picture, they kind of pointed people at that time to that picture of what you had in store. And Lord, I think we should take some of these things to our own hearts and minds and learn from them, and it would help us to see things maybe in a different light concerning you and your kingdom. Amen. So this morning, that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at a person in the Old Testament who was anonymous. We don't know what the person's name was. It might not have just been a person. It might have been a person and a group of people with them. But scholars believe it was a person because of the style of writing is continuous. But they had a lot of information, and they wrote some neat things about the history of Israel, and that's what we're going to look at. So history is really, a lot is made of history. In our country, all the time, not just now, but all the time, there are things that we learn in history. When I went to school, I learned about the founding fathers, right? And one person might, I learned certain things about the founding fathers. I can't remember everything because I'm almost 56 and that was a long time ago. But I remember enough, right? And I'm going to use Thomas Jefferson as an example. So in school, we learn all kinds of great things about Thomas Jefferson, right? All my life. When I was really involved in a certain political party, Thomas Jefferson was like our guy, right? Our guy. Half the stuff, the things about that party, if you looked it up online, a lot of it's got Thomas Jefferson quotes, Thomas Jefferson. He was a smart man. He was inventive. You read things about where he lived, his home, and the automations that he made. It's incredible. Super smart guy. A lot of the things that our country's founded on that make our country what it is, he came up with, right? Along with George Washington and Alexander Hamilton and John Adams and Benjamin Franklin and all these guys. They had really great ideas. And that's what I grew up thinking about him. And imagine my dismay when someone brings up all the terrible things about Thomas Jefferson. Because there were a lot of terrible things that he did as a human being, as with all human beings, right? So it starts to become, well, what's the focus, right? You could easily bring up a lot of the bad things he did, which probably make a lot of people today angry, depending on who they are. Or I could say, no, the good things. And then we could say things like, well, you're revising history. Well, the other person who believes all the bad things could say, well, no, you're revising history. And you grew up a whole generations on this revised history. We're just trying to bring out other truths so we can see the total person. And we want to know. And maybe they just want to focus on the bad. Maybe. Really, I think it drives people nuts, right? Going back and forth at this. We exert so much effort to try to say that one side is right or wrong. And there are things about history that I'm sure are incorrect. Even historians argue about history, right? and some things are made up, and some things are not. But does it matter, right? In the long run, what matters to God is right now in the present. And so sometimes I wonder, think about, so our country is what, 200 and almost 250 years old, 240-ish years old, right? And we have a lot of history in 200 years, a lot. Think about a little boy in Italy. What does he learn when he grows up about the history of Italy? I mean, what is the history of Italy? Not Italy as a modern country, but the land that he lives in was once the seat of an empire of the world, right? And it devolved. It became a lot of little nation states. And then they were in Europe, which was at war for hundreds of years. All the things and the people, how could someone possibly learn all of that? I just wonder, what do they learn in Italy about history, right? How important is it that that young person knows everything that happened, or if they just generalize it? Oh yeah, you know, thousands of years ago, this is what happened here, and then we had this empire thing going on, and then this happened. Or do they just focus on like the last 50 to 100 years, things that really influence more of what's going on now? Just a thought. If people evolve in their thinking, you take a look at this group right here, this church. How have we evolved from when we first started until now? Well, we've evolved in the amount of people that are here. We've evolved in the things we teach. We've evolved in the things that we believe, right? Most Christians today, modern Christianity, don't want any evolution of their minds, right? They have a Bible. It's specific. It says specific things. This is what we believe. That's it. As soon as someone says, well, what if this is true? They're done. Out. Because now all of a sudden you're a heretic. Because you're going away from what was believed. But what they don't stop and think about is in the first moments of Christianity, they believed one thing. And then 100 years from there, some of them believed different things. And then 100 years after that, things changed again. And over the hundreds of years, belief structures changed and changed and changed and changed until sometime, I'll call it in the modern past, even though it's still a couple hundred years past, a few hundred years past, people came up with a more stable belief system, and that's what we've agreed with in general, overall, right? We've all changed to how we approach the Bible and what we believe in God individually, I'm sure. I'm sure everything I believe about God and about the Bible, not everybody here believes. I'm positive, right? But that's okay. That's history. It changes. There are factual things that happened, but when we're talking about this Bible, there are a lot of factual things that are up in the air, right? If you look at archaeology and all kinds of things are discovered, all of a sudden you start saying, well, how am I going to look at that? You have to change. You have to evolve into the history of the Scripture. So my view of the Bible these days, which I've said often enough, there are some things in the Bible that cause me great questions. I think they should cause a lot of people questions, but they don't. I look at, to me, the biggest thing in the Bible that has ever bothered me over the past few years is violence. And we look at something like the conquest of Canaan, and all kinds of, to me, flags and red lights started popping up because of things that Jesus taught. I'm like, well, wait a minute. So what was that, right? Even today, we still say things like, well, God caused this. Well, God commanded that. Well, God caused this and that in the Old Testament. And today we would look at those things if it were happening and say, wow, that's way off the charts. But, and things do happen and we say that. Human beings in the Old Testament, ancient Israel, was very tribal, just like all the other nations around them. And what did tribal nations do? They were at war. They attack each other. I want this land. No, that land's mine. No, that one's mine. And then they make treaties with this guy and they go against the other one, and it just went back and forth and back and forth. And some people will say, well, that's because they were ancient people and tribal. Well, I look at today and I think, are we any different? We're very tribal. People are tribal. And so that's something I think to keep in mind when we're reading scriptures. That's just one thing for me. And that has to do with history and things that happened. And what did God have to do with those things? And that's another topic, but it has to do with history. So the Bible has history in it, and this history can be conflicting in its versions of what actually happened. Depending on where you read, there's one story, and then where you read over here, there's another story. Why? Well, in modern Christianity, what likes to happen is we like to smooth all that out, right? So where all the bumps are, we like to put our feet down and smooth it out. I was watching some funny videos this morning, and speaking of a bump, this guy just finished laying this carpet in this lady's house, and he went to get his cigarettes out, and he's like, oh. So he looks around on the carpet, and there's a lump, and he thinks that's my cigarettes. So he's stomping out that lump to smooth it out. And then the little girl comes up to mom and says, have you seen my gerbil? Oh, and the guy looks down and he could see the blood spreading. Because we don't like lumps. You lay a carpet, you want it flat. You want flat. So when we see bumps in the Bible, push them down, smooth it out. Instead of trying to examine, why is that bump there? What does it mean? Right? What does it mean? So in this book I'm reading right now by Peter Enns, he is a scholar. He attended, I can't remember now, Harvard or Yale. He went to one of them, divinity school, right? He got a degree in that, and he went to other colleges. He used to be a professor. Well, he still is a professor at one school, but he used to be a professor at one of these schools. Ivy League guy, right? Super smart. But he started believing different things about the Bible. He grew up with the Bible, Christian home, everything. And because he started questioning things, what happened? Fired. Right? Done. So he went somewhere else where they would be more accepting of it. And he started his own thing, his own ministry, we'll call it. He writes books. I'm reading the first book I've ever read by him. I listened to some of his podcasts. They're very interesting. A lot of cool stuff. He has people on and interviews them about things. But this particular book that I have here is called The Bible Tells Me So. And then the subheading is, Why Defending Scripture Has Made Us Unable to Read It. And in it, I got about halfway through, in a couple days, because it's so good, he starts talking about history in the Bible and how he sees the history of the Bible. And he says straight out, you might see it completely different, but this is something. And so this is what I want to share with you today. I didn't finish reading it all because, of course, like I said, I started making all these connections and about different things that I've come to believe, and I thought they all fit well. So Israel has a history. And in their history, they became a nation. And they lived as a nation on the earth. And they had a king. And who was their king? God was their king, right? And after quite a long time, I mean a long time, with God as their king, imagine a nation on the earth without a human king. They had an organization, governmental organization, but it was on the very local level, right? Imagine a nation existing like that. Imagine the United States as 50 states, no president, no central government, only local governments, but they all work together to stay as one common unit, right? That's kind of like what Israel was like. It was a nation, but they had no king. No centralized, massive government. And it worked. And whenever everything bad happened, they cry out to God, and God would make things happen to fix the problem. And if they went the wrong way, then God would say, oh, go ahead and do what you want. And then when the trouble came, that's how it worked for them, right? But eventually, some of them realized, hey, wait a minute, all these other countries, look at the things they could accomplish. Because they have a standing army, they have a king, they have a government. We want that. Because we're tired of the people that come up and help us just end up doing terrible things. And Samuel's kids were part of that, right? And so the people come up to them and they say, look, Samuel, we can see how this is going to go. Your sons are judges like all the other ones, and they're going down the same road as all the other guys. We want some stability. We're tired of the ups and downs. So we want a king. And of course, Samuel's upset. But in 1 Samuel 8:7, we will be going to the scriptures today, but there's some I'm just going to read for you. It says, the Lord said to Samuel, listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say to you. For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. And then he gives them a whole list of all the things that's going to happen in their country if they get a physical king. And all those things happened, right? They're terrible things. Just like every other country that's ever been on the face of the earth, right? They all follow that same pattern that God laid out to one extent or the other, right? They had to be like the rest. They couldn't just be happy with, God is our king, we're going to live in the present with God in our presence, even though it's in a tabernacle, and only the priest can go see him and all this. But we know that God is here, and we can see things that God does for us. It's not good enough. So that became the beginnings of their formation as a kingdom of the world. And in the scriptures, you can read all about the kings and all about the things that happened. Peter Enns says that 67% of the Old Testament narrative is about Israel as a nation and their history. 80% of the books in the Old Testament are about Israel in its history and the things they did, according to him. So that's interesting to me. Most of the Old Testament is about that. It's interesting and it makes sense because it's about that relationship between God and the people that he chose. So eventually, David becomes king, and then his son Solomon becomes king, and we start to see some differences in this kingdom. It lasted for a long time as a nice, good kingdom, just like all the other ones, fought in wars, levied taxes, did all the same things as everybody else, worshiped the gods in different ways, worshiped God, and something was going wrong, like happens in most kingdoms of the world, right? Our nation's only 200 and some years old. It's young. Other nations in Europe or elsewhere, they've gotten bigger, they've gotten smaller, bigger, smaller, some disappeared, other ones popped up. That's the way that nations go. And it was no different for Israel. In 1 Kings 12, 4-5, it says, your father made our yoke hard. This is Solomon. They're talking to Rehoboam, Solomon's son, who's going to be the king. Solomon did a lot of cool things in Israel. He built a lot of stuff. He modernized it, but he did so on the backs of his people. Taxes, labor, forced labor. They say, your father made our yoke hard. Now, therefore, lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke, which he put on us, and he will serve you. And we will serve you. Then he said, depart from me for 3 days, then return to me. So the people departed. They leave, and Rehoboam gathers his counselors. And on his council, to no surprise, when a new president becomes president of the United States, there is an existing body, some new, some old, they come and go, but there's an existing body, the Congress, and then there's the Senate. And they guide, mostly it's them that guide what happens in the country, but they guide it. And so what does the president have to work with? Whoever's there. Rehoboam had whoever was there. The only difference to Rehoboam was these people weren't all elected, right? They were chosen. He asked the guys that were his father's counselors, and they said, well, yeah, really, honestly, everything your father was doing was not great. You need to lower the taxes and lighten the burden. And Rehoboam's like, I don't know. So he goes and he asked his friends, the people he grew up with, the younger minds, and they said, no, more taxes, more work. And what does Rehoboam choose? More taxes, more work. If you keep reading down in 1 Kings 12 and verses 13 and 14, it says, the king answered the people harshly, for he forsook the advice of the elders which they had given him. And he spoke to them according to the advice of the young men, saying, my father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. So do it or die. Pay the money, do the work, or die. He doesn't sound like he's going to be a good leader at all, right? So what happens? 10 tribes of the north say, it's not going to happen. See ya. And they divide. That leaves 2, Judah and Benjamin. And Judah, Rehoboam says, no way, we're not letting you go. And he prepares for battle. But God says, don't fight them. Stay with who you are. This was part of my judgment against your father. For everything he created and everything that he did with all the other gods and all the women he got involved with and all that he devolved the worship of this nation, I had to split it. So Judah doesn't split, or they stay split. They don't fight. Now, if you continue reading 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, you're going to find a tumultuous history of a kingdom, and then splitting into 2 kingdoms. And these books are going to take you through the kings and leaders of both nations, men and women, and all the awful things that they did, because almost every description of every king and every person in those books is terrible. And all the terrible things they did. There's a few that were good, right? But most of them were awful. And eventually, both end up in captivity. The northern tribes go off into captivity, and they literally melt into the woodwork. And today, Christians like to say, oh, they're the lost tribes. We know who they are, you know, blah, 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 blah. You don't. The northern tribes melt away into the woodwork of the world, just like God told them to. Stay there. Find work. Make families. Help the countries that you live in. Become good members of society, basically. And that's what most of them do. Judah goes off into captivity, but some of them are allowed to return and rebuild and make a nation that's not really a nation. It never really gains independence. They still have leaders and rulers, and they go through all this. They eventually spawn the religious system that is in place in Jesus' day, but nothing ever really takes root and happens. These people, whoever wrote 1 and 2 Samuel, it wasn't Samuel, and 1 and 2 Kings, it wasn't any of those kings, because they wrote it a couple hundred years after they started getting into captivity. They started penning down everything that happened. And when they wrote everything out, they had one thing in mind. We used to be a nation, and all of these scoundrels that ruled us ruined it. And that's how they wrote. That's how they wrote. Well, there was one central thing that got rebuilt, and that was the temple. And David wanted to build God a temple. And in 2 Samuel chapter 7, the Lord talks to Nathan, the same prophet that told David his child was going to die because of what he did with Bathsheba. And this prophet comes back to David and says, God says you're not going to build me a temple, but your son is, or one of your offspring are going to build it. But David, you're going to die a peaceful death in your country, and you're going to lay with your fathers. and your son is going to rule, and he is going to build a temple. And in 1 Chronicles 28:3, David tells his son why he couldn't build the temple, but why his son has to. It's nowhere in Kings where David says this. But he says, "But God said to me, you shall not build a house for my name because you are a man of war and have shed blood." You could make a lot out of that statement, right? A lot of why he shed blood and why the wars happened and everything else. But God says you can't build it. But he does tell him in 2 Samuel 7:16, part of the prophecy, "Your house and your kingdom shall endure before me forever. Your throne shall be established forever." Notice the word "your," because it's very important. God tells David, you, the human being, are going to have offspring, and they are going to continue in this land forever and have this throne forever, your progeny. Does that happen? No, it doesn't happen. But God told him, your people. The reason it didn't happen was because of people, right? Now here comes another guy. And he is known by scholars as the chronicler. This guy was super smart, right? Why was he smart? Well, sometime after the captivity, like a long time after the captivity, this guy starts writing a book about the history of Israel. And it is going to be completely different than the other books of the history of Israel. And this was written, they believe, sometime around, or started around 550 BC, after their long captivity. He has a benefit that the other ones didn't have. They wrote theirs during captivity, when they were upset about being in captivity and why they were in captivity. So their mindset of history was different than his mindset of history. Their mindset of history was terrible, terrible, terrible. His mindset of history is going to turn out to be awesome, awesome, awesome. Two different histories. I told Lisa this morning, I thought of this great illustration. I thought it was great. And she's like, yeah, that's great. So I'll share it with you. Little Abraham. It's 100 BC. Little Abraham is done with school for the day. But dad is fishing and mom is drying fish because they have to go to the market and they have to make money. So grandma goes to pick up Abraham from school. That sounds very familiar to me. I had a little boy. I couldn't always pick him up because mom and dad are working. So grandma and grandpa took care of him, right? And grandma picks him up and says, "What did you learn today?" And unlike children today, when you ask what they learned, I don't want to tell you. Why are you asking me these questions? Abraham said, "We learned about history, Grandma." Well, what did you learn? I learned that David was a fantastic, awesome king, and that someday someone from his line is going to come up and rule us again as a king, and we're going to have a great nation. And Grandma says, unbelievable. What are they teaching you kids? Because when Grandma grew up, she learned more about the awfulness of David and why they were not a kingdom now and this other kingdom was ruling over them. Right? And so she argues with them and says, David was a rascal. He was terrible. He had a man killed so he could have his wife. Why would you want a king to come from him? And the little boy is just like, wow. Dumbfounded. Because everything that he just was taught in school was how great David was. That's Chronicles compared to Kings, right? What is he learning? This next writer, the chronicler, has some advantages. He's not living in captivity. Although they don't have a kingdom, he's not in captivity. And even though they have another kingdom over them, or other people ruling them, he still has some freedom to do some things. And one of them is to learn and write. He has 1st and 2nd Samuel. He has 1st and 2nd Kings. He also has Isaiah and Jeremiah and the minor prophets. And he has Proverbs. And he has at least some, if not most, of the Psalms at his fingertips. Because he's a learned person. Not everybody at that point has that stuff, but he does. And he also has other people like him around who are reading it and studying it. And they know the promises that were made to Abraham. And they know the covenant. And God's Spirit is working in this man and saying, I want you to write about this. God doesn't tell him exactly what to write. He doesn't say, write out these words. But God says, I have something coming that's incredible. And I need you to pen this out so people have it. Unfortunately, according to Mr. Enns, most Christians bypass Chronicles because they see Chronicles as just another historical book and a repeat. But it's not a repeat at all. This man lived in Jerusalem at least 200 years after Jerusalem had been in the rebuild, somewhere around 350 to 300 BC. That's like a real focused area. People believe it's anywhere between 200 and 400 BC or 450 BC that Chronicles was written. But long after all these things happened, he had all different resources and a completely different mindset within to write the history. And it was what was happening in the present. The people of Judges, even Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, Kings had a wholly different mindset depending on the present that they lived in at the time. Modern minds today would have a field day with the chronicler because they would say, you are revising history. But he's not really revising history. He's just focusing on different things that happen in history compared to the others. Chronicles leaves out a lot of stuff that happens in 1st and 2nd Kings. A lot. He focuses more on the good things. There are bad things in Chronicles too, for sure. But he's pushing people to read history from an angle that's going to show them something is happening. And so he starts with Adam. And he continues on all the way through this history, from Adam all the way up to where he is, and how does he end it? You think about David. Turn over to 2 Chronicles 36, please. You think about David, and in Kings, David wants to build a temple. God says, no, you're not building my temple. We found out in Chronicles why. Your son's going to build the temple. David, you did all these things. I'm not having you build my temple. What does the chronicler say about David in the temple? He gives David 8 chapters of God revealed to David and David to his son how we're going to build this temple. He makes David almost like a Moses-like state. Like David received this revelation about the temple that Kings doesn't give David. Why does the chronicler, did that really happen? The chronicler says it did. Whether it really happened or not doesn't matter. It fits into where the chronicler is pointing the people that are going to read his book, like young Abraham in school. It says in verse 22, now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he sent a proclamation throughout his kingdom and put it in writing, saying, thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth and has appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever there is among you of all his people, may the Lord his God be with him, and let him go up. That's a pretty cool ending. That's way different than the ending of 2 Kings. And you might say, well, obviously, Dan, because in 2 Kings they went off into captivity and they hadn't seen this yet because they were still writing in captivity. The chronicler can look back and see this because he could see, okay, well, Jeremiah said everything he said that the Lord said to him about them going back. And so now he can write out, and it all ended. And this king said, go back. Let's make the temple, and let's make this again. That is a statement of hope. Some wrote of a statement of discontent and unhappiness. The other one can write out of the same exact situations of hope and something to come. And then follows the last two books of the Old Testament, Ezra and Nehemiah, who certainly have their troubles. But the end result is completely different. There's a temple. There's Jerusalem. So there's a passage that mirrors the one I read in 2 Samuel, where it's your kingdom. And it talks about something that's going to happen with a kingdom, but it's not your kingdom. So go over to 1 Chronicles 17. Everybody is waiting for something because of what the chronicler has just written. Because of what, I almost view it as, people have these prophets and they don't know what to do with it yet, right? Because of their situation. And the chronicler comes along and writes things. He takes things the prophets wrote. He takes the history of Israel and he shows, hey, something is going to happen. It is going to happen, because I want you to remember, the last two books of the Old Testament were not Jeremiah and Isaiah or the little minor prophets. They were Ezra and Nehemiah. And what came just before Ezra and Nehemiah was Chronicles. Chronicles really, in the chronology of the Bible, shouldn't come after 1st and 2nd Kings. It should come after the prophets. Because he wrote about things in the prophets. Because he had, again, hindsight of 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Samuel, Judges, Jeremiah, Isaiah, Malachi, all of that. And he's putting it all together and putting their history together and saying, wait, something's happened. So by the time Jesus comes, they're waiting for this king to come and raise up an army with God and angel armies and wipe out the Romans and set their kingdom again. Because of what was written in Chronicles. And because of what he wrote in Chronicles, now they're taking things that happen in the prophets and they're kind of putting it together and saying, oh yeah, something is happening. That wasn't the end. So in Chronicles, again, same story, Nathan the prophet speaking to David about the temple. Again, you're not going to build the temple, all those things. And he says in verses 11 to 14, when your days are filled up that you must go to be with your fathers, that I will set up one of your descendants after you, who will be of your sons, and I will establish his kingdom. That's the first word that's different. That says something different is happening. I will establish his kingdom. Not your kingdom, David, his kingdom. He shall build for me a house, and I will establish his throne forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. And I will not take my loving kindness away from him, as I took it from him who was before you. To all these people, kings that were before you, that these terrible things, I took my loving kindness away from them. Not because I didn't want them to have it, because they stepped out of it. They left it. And I just let them go their way. But I will settle him in my house and in my kingdom forever. And his throne shall be established forever. Now we can read this, right? We can read this because of where Chronicles was placed and everything that's happened. Well, it's Solomon. He's going to build the house, my house. He's going to build my temple. I'm going to live with him. I'm going to show him loving kindness, and it's going to last forever. But Solomon does what? He's got a problem. Solomon has a big problem. He's got a woman problem. He can't keep his hands off of women from all around the world, right? Because he's a popular big guy who's super smart, has got lots of money, a beautiful kingdom, and he's getting every wife he can possibly have. And when he has a wife, he doesn't just have her and say, so this is what we believe here in my kingdom. And this is who we worship, and this is who you're going to worship. She says, no, this is what I have from my kingdom, and this is who I worship, and this is who I'm going to worship, and you, because I'm so beautiful, and lovely are going to build me a temple for my gods, right? Like my kingdom works. And Solomon says, you're right, I am. And he builds it. And eventually, Israel is a disaster. A disaster. A disaster with who they worship, a disaster with forced labor, a disaster in high taxes, and it falls apart. So it didn't last forever. So what was God saying? What was the chronicler trying to say? He wasn't trying to say, hey, David, you're going to have a son. And your son's name is Solomon. And he's going to build this temple. And from Solomon on down, it's going to be your line. And you guys are going to rule in this kingdom forever. The chronicler was saying, not that. He was saying, hey, all this stuff happened. But because of the greatness of David and the greatness of Solomon and the greatness of everything that Israel was, God is going to raise up a king that's going to be after David's line. Because you know what Chronicles doesn't have? It doesn't have most of the terrible things that David did because his hands were bloody. Because it's focusing on the greatness of David. And it's trying to bring up all the great things about him, because out of this great man is going to come another great man who's going to do something awesome. The chronicler doesn't realize it yet. But what he has just done is given people in Israel a hope of someone who's coming, and he thinks it's going to be a guy who's going to have a crown on his head and hold a sword and call the armies. He doesn't realize that this guy's going to come and he's going to have a king or throne that lasts forever, that the loving kindness of God is going to last in forever, and not only through that man or that son, but it's going to go throughout all humanity. And that guy is going to go through some things and is going to raise up, and when he raises up, he's going to start a temple, and that temple, as Jesus says, and Paul says, is not made with hands. The one made with hands, gone. And it's never coming back. That nation that you had, gone. And it's never coming back in the way of nations on this earth. It's coming back as a kingdom and as a temple that's going to be built out of who the people are. They're going to be the temple, and I'm going to come and live with them. Always and forever, and I'm going to be their king, just like I was supposed to be in the beginning, forever. So when these people are reading from Chronicles and little Abraham's learning, that's what he's learning. Not what grandma learned about all the terrible things that Israel was and why it fell and why they still didn't have a kingdom. Two different history books in the Bible, focusing on two different things, one saying all these things that happened, and the other one not even touching most of that. Today, we would call that revisionist history. You're focusing on the wrong things, and because you are, you're teaching the wrong story. Slaves to the past. Now, I want to read this. This is Peter Enns. And in this chapter, which is only a couple pages, he talks about slaves to the past. And I'm going to start with this. He talks about things about conquest of Canaan and other things and the ancient approaches to the Bible. And he starts getting into this, which got me really getting into it. But he says, fretting over how the Bible presents the past, which is so unlike our way, and then smoothing over the differences to make the Bible behave, betrays a deeply held, likely unconscious, false expectation that the Bible should act according to our alien expectations. Why is my expectation of this book as a modern Christian alien to it? Because it was written by ancient people in a different time, in their present, looking at their past, and seeing what did it all mean. I can't apply modern things to this. Cramming the stories of Israel into a modern mold of history, writing not only makes the Bible look like utter nonsense, it also obscures what the Bible models for us about our own spiritual journey. On that journey, what matters most is not simply where we've been, the triumphs or tragedies, but where we are with God now in the moment. All great spiritual leaders will tell us that living in the moment is the key to a vibrant communion with God. The now is where God's presence is found, where neither the past memories nor the future with its idle speculations dominates. We are products of our past, no doubt, but not forever so, as if our past has written our life script in cement. We choose, as did the writers of the Gospels and the stories of Israel, how to read the past, and we wish to accept now. We adapt and transform the past into who we are and what we wish to become in our relationship with God. The past informs the present, but it also serves the present. When the present serves the past, we are stuck in nostalgia, longing for the good old days, a sure recipe for emotional and spiritual dysfunction. The diverse stories of the past that we find in the Bible are not a problem to be solved. They model for us the spiritual immediacy of the present. The stories of Jesus and of Israel's dismal slide from kingship to exile also serve another purpose. They are windows onto how the Bible as a whole handles the past. Wherever biblical writers talk about the past, we should expect them to be shaping the past as well. The more comfortable we are with this idea, the better off we will be when we turn to one of the more controversial portions of the Bible when it comes to history. Israel's stories of the deep past, its origins long, long ago. We have to remember why we have this. And we can't be afraid to read it and say, really, maybe what I thought about that isn't true. We have to not be afraid of all the hills and valleys and realize that they're there for a reason. Some of the things that young Christians today are leaving Christianity for, one of the things is that they can't get the answers because everybody wants to smooth everything out, but they see contradictions and controversy and they want to know, what is that about? And Christianity today says, no, that's not there. And they come up with reasons why it should just be smoothed out. Those are the things we shouldn't be afraid of. Those are the things we should be able to dive in and say, it's for a reason. That hill or that valley is there for a reason. What is it? I got to stop. Amen.